This video is part of the series on plant primary structure and growth and relates to Chapter 35 in Campbell Biology. In this video, I'm going to answer the question, why does a plant look like a plant? And more specifically, why does it not look like an animal? Now, nothing against any of the other great kingdoms out there, but I'm going to be trying to compare plants to animals because those are our two kingdoms that we're going to be focusing on in this class. And besides fungi, they're the two kingdoms which are predominantly multicellular. In this lecture, I'm going to look at 6 important differences between plants, kingdom Plantae, and animals, kingdom Animalia. Okay, so the big first difference I want to think about is nutrition. So animals are heterotrophs. More specifically, they're ingestive heterotrophs. And plants are autotrophs, specifically photoautotrophs. So first of all, let's take apart that word. Troph, T-R-O-P-H, has to do with feeding. Hetero means other. So a heterotroph is an eater of others. An ingestive heterotroph is specifically an eater of others that has some sort of way to take the food into their body and then digest the food inside their body. A autotroph, auto means self, troph means feeder, so an autotroph is a self-feeder, and photo means light, so it's a self-feeder that uses light to feed itself. All bodies need nutrients and energy for growth. And growth is needed in order to reproduce, and reproduction is needed in order to pass on genes to the next generation, and across many generations, we get evolution. In Biology 213, we're going to be looking at anatomy and trying to connect that anatomy to function and understand how the specific forms of the anatomy enables and at the same time constrains the particular types of functions. Those functions are there because they evolved, because they are adaptations that allow the organisms to gather the nutrients and energy they need for growth, to grow and reproduce, and then to be able to pass on their genes. So throughout this class, we're going to be asking you to explain how form or anatomy allows for adaptive function, which is physiology. And in this introductory lecture, I want to look at how plant form allows its function in order to be able to be a successful photoautotroph. Okay, so key difference number 2 is SAV ratio. SAV stands for surface area to volume ratio. So plants have big surface area to volume ratio, while animals have fairly compact bodies and generally tend to have much lower surface area to volume ratio. This makes sense in light of the differences in modes of nutrition. A plant needs to collect diffuse, unconcentrated, spread out resources. Those resources for a plant are things like light energy, carbon dioxide, water, minerals. Carbon dioxide, let's just take that one for example, is less than 1% of the gases in our air, and it's spread out throughout the environment. Water, not very concentrated, spread out throughout the soil. Minerals, also very unconcentrated, spread out. Light, spread out. All of these resources that a plant needs, it needs to collect it through and across its surface. So the more surface a plant can have, the more successful it's going to be at collecting these diffuse resources that it needs in order to grow. On the other hand, an animal generally needs to be able to, as an ingestive heterotroph, find concentrated packages of energy. So here's a plant collecting a diffuse resource, which is light. And here's the incredible surface area of the root system that collects all of those resources below ground, like water and minerals. Okay, big difference number 3 is mobility. Plants are mostly stationary, no surprise there, and animals are mostly mobile. There are exceptions to this. There are stages of the plant life cycle where plants do disperse, and there are animal stages and forms that are non-mobile. But for the most part, plants are stationary, and for the most part, animals are fairly mobile. This makes sense. If you're a plant and you imagine having this body with an incredibly large surface area to volume ratio, you cannot effectively move your body around. You would just physically have too much drag to be able to effectively move your body and not expend all the ATP you have for energy. Animals, remember, need to find concentrated resources. They therefore have evolved things like muscles and nerves, and they have fairly compact bodies with a lot less drag, and it's fairly easy for them to therefore move their bodies around. Plants are pretty clever. During those life stages where they need to move themselves around, they like to hitch a ride on other organisms like animals. They're like, hey, we'll let the animals use their ATP and move us around. Okay, key difference number 4, response to the environment. Animals mostly respond with movement. If you think about your pet or an animal you know, it moves to find things like food or water or shelter. Animals move typically to find mates. And there's many more examples. Plants, because they don't move around, they respond to their environment with growth. So some examples. Flowers are a growth response to help bring sex cells together for sexual reproduction. Phototropism is growth movement in response to light. Geotropism is a growth movement in response to gravity. So if you put a plant in a windowsill, you may notice that it turns and grows towards the light. It's responding to its environment with phototropism. The shoot system of a plant is what we call positively phototropic because it moves towards the direction of the stimulus, which is the light. The shoot system is negatively geotropic. It moves in the opposite direction of gravity. Meanwhile, the root system is positively geotropic. Roots will grow down in the direction of gravity. So a hint here for you. The word tropic is very similar, but is not the same as the word trophic. So plants are autotrophs. They have an autotrophic mode of nutrition. Note the H in the word. Tropic is a movement. Trophic has to do with feeding. So just a hint, keep those two separate in your mind. Okay, key difference number 5 is growth. Plants have a kind of growth which is described as localized and indeterminate. Localized meaning that they grow from very specific points. This growth from points happens because they have a special tissue called a meristem. Animals have a type of growth which tends to occur all over, and so it's called generalized growth. So for example, when I compare my arm to that of my 6-year-old's, his is shorter and his hand is smaller. As he grows older, he's going to grow, and he's going to grow all over in a generalized way such that his whole arm gets bigger. It's going to get wider as well as longer. His whole hand's going to get larger. If he were a plant, though, he would grow from the tips of his fingers, and only from those tips, growing longer while not growing overall. Plants also have a kind of growth that's called indeterminate, meaning that they grow forever throughout their entire lives. Most animals show determinate growth, meaning they have a specific trajectory in which they grow as juveniles to a mature size. Plants never reach a true mature size. They continue to grow through their entire lives. So this localized and indeterminate growth that plants have is pretty special. And it's possible thanks to a kind of tissue called meristems, or the meristem tissue. Meristem tissue is a perpetually embryonic tissue. The cells inside the meristem are called initials. And initials are cells that remain as a source of new cells throughout the entire life of the plant. Another word for initials is stem cells. Initials are stem cells. They are able to give rise to any and all other cell types. This is also what's termed totipotent. So totipotent is what it means for a cell to be able to give rise to any and all other cell types. Plants grow in two ways. So they grow in what's called a primary growth way. This is growth that comes from meristems, specifically called apical meristems. And these apical meristems give rise to primary tissues that lengthen the body of the plant. So if you look in this picture here, you see the tips of this Douglas fir tree here, and this is this lighter colored branch here. This is this new year's growth starting to grow out. And it's growing from the very tip here. And it's going to lengthen that branch. The other kind of growth that a plant does is called secondary growth, and it occurs from a different set of meristem tissues called the lateral meristems. These lateral meristems give rise to secondary tissues, and these secondary tissues increase the girth of the plant in areas that are no longer growing in length. So for example, the tree trunk. You can see this picture here of this individual trying to hug this huge tree in the Olympic National Forest. And this tree has gotten quite wide thanks to the efforts of lateral meristems leading to secondary tissues, which have increased the girth of this tree trunk. Localized and indeterminate growth is really, really significant for plants, really important. Some of the reasons that it's important. It allows plants to continually reach out to intercept more and diffuse resources. Because the resources need to be collected through their surface, and because they're spread out and unconcentrated, they constantly have to be reaching for them, whether that means the roots growing deeper into the soil, looking for more minerals or more sources of water, or whether it's like this tree here, where the tree is reaching out over the road because there's more sunlight over the road. Also, we've talked about how the plant body has a really, really high surface area to volume ratio. Well, that also means that a lot of the plant body tends to be short-lived. So, for example, leaves are a piece of the body that has extremely high surface area to volume. That means that it's got a lot of area to be exposed to damage from physical and biological forces. And so it's easier for these huge surface area to volume ratio structures to have a fairly short life because they're too hard to repair and maintain in good function. And so after a while, they simply need to be replaced. So think about like deciduous trees which drop their leaves every year and grow new ones every spring. And then finally, because plants can't get up and run to a new space, because they are stationary, they need to be able to be flexible developmentally. Animals tend to have a fairly defined form that they grow towards. Plants, on the other hand, tend to be extremely phenotypically plastic, meaning that their form can change and take on a lot of different alterations. So for example, again, this tree is growing out over this road in response to where there's more light. It's not fixed to having a specific shape that grows straight upwards, for example. And instead, its body plan grows and develops in response to the environment. Okay, the sixth major difference between plants and animals that I want to hit on here is one that you've been introduced to in your prior course in 211, and that is cellular differences. But just a quick recap here. Here's a picture of a plant cell. So plant cells have a few cool things that animal cells typically do not. Plant cells have chloroplasts that animal cells do not. Plant cells have a large central vacuole, and the membrane around that central vacuole is called the tonoplast. They have a cell wall, which is outside of the cell membrane. And then they have these amazing channels, these membrane-lined channels that connect adjacent cells called plasmodesmata. So those are all some differences. I also want to point out some similarities. So plant cells, like animal cells, have mitochondria, and they use these as part of the cellular respiration process to break down sugars in order to get ATP and NADH in order to have energy. They similarly have a cytoskeleton, and they've got a nucleus and lots of DNA. I do want to take another minute to talk a little bit more about the cell wall. So the cell wall is produced from materials which have to be synthesized inside the living part of the cell. That living part of the cell produces the components for the cell wall and then ships them out to the outside of the cell. And the first cell wall that's built is called the primary wall. Here, the primary wall. So all plant cells have a primary wall that's secreted as the cell grows and develops. And the primary component of the primary wall is cellulose. So you can think about this as being sort of like a piece of paper. A piece of paper has a lot of cellulose in it. Not all cells produce secondary walls. Some cells do, and if they do produce a secondary wall, it's going to be produced after the primary wall. To produce that secondary wall, the cell is going to have to produce more cell wall material in the living internal part of the cell inside the cell membrane. So in the cytoplasm, it's going to be producing more proteins and carbohydrates in order to build the secondary wall. And then it's going to have to ship them to the outside of the cell, releasing them at the cell membrane. Because that secondary cell wall is formed after the primary wall, it's going to be interior to the primary wall. So if you look at this diagram up here, here's the central vacuole of this upper cell. And it's pressed right up against, so the vacuole's tonoplast seems to be pressed right up against the plasma membrane of the cell. And then we have the secondary wall, which is interior to the primary wall, which is here. Again, the secondary wall is interior because the primary wall was produced first and then was pushed out by the production of the secondary wall. This is a different cell down here on the lower side. And so we can see its vacuole, its membrane, its secondary wall, and then its primary wall. And then the space between the two cells where the two walls touch is called the middle lamella. And it's adhesive and it cements together the cell walls of adjacent cells. So plant cells, as they are formed, are cemented together, and so they can't migrate to new positions. They're stuck together in place. Again, every cell has a primary wall. Not all cells form a secondary wall. Okay, so in this video, I tried to answer, why does a plant look like a plant? We talked about 6 points of difference. comparing plants with animals. We looked at nutrition, surface area to volume ratio, mobility, response to environment, growth differences, and some cellular differences.